Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me here on Investigation Bible. I am your biblical investigator, Bill Kaufman, and I'm now 10:8 on this episode. All right, we're continuing famous biblical characters, and we're going to talk about the first three kings of Israel. And they are famous, especially two of them. The first one's famous, but the second and third one are like crazy famous. Okay, there's actually another one in between, but we're not even going to talk about him because I mean, maybe he's super important, but I don't know anything about him and doesn't record a lot about him. So just his name doesn't really tell us too much. It does tell us some, but I don't know much about him, so I'm not going to bring him up. All right, but the first one we're going to talk about is King Saul. Now, King Saul is the first king of Israel. Now, there was, during the days of the judges, somebody that called themselves king, but the reality is they were just a local little tribal chieftain. Okay, because now this is 12 tribes since Moses got the people free from Egypt. Joshua defeated the people that were in the Holy Lands, most of them. And then the people started living there. And then they had these judges. We talked about some of those already. We talked about Saul, Samson, and I think Deborah. But there's a few others. Samuel is one we can talk about today. He's still a judge. And he's kind of in charge of Israel in the 1000s. Okay, like between 1000 BC and 1100 BC, Samuel's in charge. He had an interesting story. As a small child, his mother couldn't have a baby. She asked for a baby. God gave her one. She took him to learn at the priest's home, the high priest, and God spoke to the boy, and he thought that the high priest Eli was calling him, and so he asked him what he wanted, and Eli's like, I think it was, after a couple of times, he said, I think it was God calling you, and it was, because the guy's name is Samuel, and he has a really big story here in the Bible, but we're not really talking about him today, even though he was one of the judges of Israel. He was the last judge of Israel, though, because the people clamored for a king, and Samuel was the one that gave them the king, okay? He anointed the king, the one that God told him to anoint for king. And that was this guy named Saul. Now, Saul was from the Northeast, kind of like in our country, maybe you'd say Boston. He was way up there at the high part of the country, over on the side. Now, remember, this is a loose confederation of tribal states here. Kind of like the United States, when we first won our independence, we were the United States, but we were run under the Articles of Confederacy. We weren't really one unit yet, okay? And that didn't work out too good, so we eventually got to be a real country with a constitution and all that kind of thing. And we are still to this day. Well, similar thing here. All these tribes were running themselves. And they weren't running themselves for the betterment of Israel. They were running themselves only for the betterment of themselves. And so eventually it didn't work out too well. They kept losing a lot. And so they wanted to make a king like everybody else had. And so they asked for a king. God gave them a king. And it was this guy named Saul. Now, Saul was born sometime around 1070 BC. Okay? I'm not 100% sure what year because I don't know exactly. But roughly about 1070 years before Jesus is when Saul's on the earth. That's when he's born. So he is within 100 years of Samson. We talked about Samson, and everybody knows about Samson and his long hair and getting it cut and all that kind of stuff and how strong he was. Well, he lived probably difference between Saul and Samson is about difference between now and maybe World War II. So there were some really old people who probably knew who Samson was when Saul was a little boy. Anyway, that's just how close they were together. They weren't in the same tribe. Samson's from the tribe of Dan. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Still, nonetheless, Samson was a pretty famous guy of his time. So now, that has nothing. We talked about that last time, though. So that kind of just puts us into this one. So about 1070, this kid is born up in the Northeast. He is a really good-looking guy. That's what it says in the Bible. He is tall. He's taller than everybody, which is the opposite to me because I'm short. 5'8" on my driver's license whenever I measured the last time, and I've not changed it. So I don't even know if I am anymore. I'm 62 now. I might not be 5'8" anymore. I might be 5'7.5". But anyway, so I'm not a tall person by any stretch of the imagination. But Saul was. He was a tall man. Somebody probably in today's world, it says he's head and shoulders above the crowd. head and shoulders, which we still use that term. It's a biblical term, by the way. And so Saul is very tall, 6.5 foot tall guy in our society today, really handsome, but he doesn't have any self-confidence whatsoever. None. He has no self-confidence. God worked this whole thing out. It's kind of an interesting story. His dad, Saul's dad, had a bunch of livestock and stuff, and a bunch of donkeys, which were very prized animals in that time where they lived. They got out. They broke down the corral. I don't know. Whatever they did, they got out and they were missing. So Saul, his dad says, Saul, take a servant with you and go find them. Take one of the guys that works for us, a hired hand, because that's what they were. They were hired hands. And he's like, take a hired hand with you and go find him. So he does. And he doesn't find them, though. He goes to look for them. Well, eventually Saul gets tired of looking for him, and he says, hey, we probably should go back. I mean, my dad's going to start worrying about us, for gosh sakes. Not even worrying about the donkeys anymore. He's going to worry about us. Well, the guy that he's going with him is probably older than Saul. Saul's a young man now, and probably older than Saul. Doesn't say that, just can see it in the makeup of stuff. He says, hey, I got a plan. Why don't we go to this next town right over here at Gilgal, I think it was. I could be wrong on that. I'm just doing that off memory. But anyway, let's go to this next town, and there's a prophet there that hears from God. He's called. In fact, it even says in 1 Samuel, this is in 1 Samuel, it says there's a seer, and this is what it says, because Samuel's written as a history. It says in those days, the prophets were called seers. I thought that's interesting. It just says in those days, that's what they were called. And my wife and I were just watching an old movie the other day, and man, the slang they use, I'll tell you, man, 1950s movie, and the slang, it's just crazy. Money was called lettuce. You got enough lettuce and all this kind of stuff. I mean, out of context, I can't even understand what they're saying, but that's the same way we are now. Things go on, and there's different slang and different ways of saying stuff. Well, it says that back a few years ago, they called these prophets seers, and Samuel was that. So, but of course now, I don't know how it worked out then, but Saul said, well, we don't got any money to give him, and I'm out of food. So we can't give him anything to tell us where the donkeys are. And the guy says, well, I got a little bit of money saved up. I got a little bit of silver, and I'll give my own money for it. But I want to hear from this prophet. So they go see him. Well, God told that prophet the day before that a guy's going to come to you from the tribe of Benjamin, and I'm going to have you anoint him king. And that's what happens. He meets him. I mean, it's a long story there in the scriptures, but in 1 Samuel. But he says, okay, you're going to be king. God's going to make you king. Well, he doesn't want to be. He's like, I don't want to be king. And then they go back to his hometown. Oh, he also tells him, hey, don't worry about the donkeys. They've been found. But you got to go back to your hometown. So they all go back to the hometown, including the prophet that everybody respects is the prophet, Samuel. And all of Israel respects this guy. And so they go back there, and they get there, and his uncle actually says, hey, how you doing? Where you been gone so long? He goes, oh, he does not tell him that Samuel said he was going to be king because he's too embarrassed about it. So he just kind of says, oh, well, I was looking for the donkeys. And well, then it comes time, and Samuel is going to anoint Saul to be king. And when he does this, he gives this big old thing about what God said. And where's Saul? Nowhere to be found. What? And they said, well, where is he? And one of the guys says, he's hiding in the barn. What do you mean he's hiding in the barn? Yeah, he's hiding in the barn. He doesn't want to be king. But God wants him to be king. The people want him to be king because he's tall and good looking. And so they drag him out. And Saul anoints him to be king. And by the way, at first it works out real good. There was a city that in Israel, they got attacked by Ammonites. They're across the way there and other side of the Dead Sea. And they come and they attack this city. And they tell them, give up and surrender. And if you surrender on your own, then we'll just poke out the eye of every male adult. That's all we'll do, just to be a disgrace to Israel. That's what they said. If you don't surrender, we're going to attack and we're going to kill all of you. Man, woman, and child, everybody's dying, okay? Killing your goats. I mean, everybody's gone. But if you give up, we'll just poke out your eye. Only one eye, too. See how nice and magnanimous these people were? Well, Saul hears about it, and it says that the Spirit of the Lord rose up in him, and he got the whole of Israel. He did it through chopping up one of his own oxen and sending it out and saying, "This will happen to everybody's oxen if you don't follow me." And so he goes out. In other words, all your oxen will die if you don't do this. And everybody, the fear of the Lord came upon them, and they all followed Saul, and they go and they defeat the Ammonites in battle. And so the city doesn't have to all be killed, or they don't even have to have an eye poked out. So, well, he had a couple other victories too. And it was like, to the people, they were like, wow, this is great. But then he really starts getting into some depression and mental health issues. Okay. And there's no doubt he does. He gets married, undoubtedly. He starts having kids. We know at least a few of the kids' names. A daughter named Michael, and a son named Jonathan. I can't even pronounce his oldest son's name. Ism. That's not right. That's not right. I don't even remember how to pronounce it. But anyway, we know that he had these kids and that he became king and everything. Now, he didn't really build a big palace yet, I don't think. I don't think we're really in the big palace time yet. But he doesn't rule in Jerusalem, not yet. Okay. So anyway, but he is the king of all Israel, and all of Israel accepts this because Samuel anointed him to be king. But then he kind of loses it, and when he does, it says that the Spirit of God left him, and he starts doing things against what God said to do. And he even goes and talks to a divination person. Now, the reason that's a big deal is because these divination people were outlawed by Moses. You can't have people talking to the dead, all right? And he goes and does that. But he had enforced Moses' laws, so this lady was scared that it was a trick. You're going to trick me. You're tricking me into getting a death sentence. And he goes, no, I'm not tricking you. I just need to know what's going on. And so he went to, like, if we went to, in the scriptures, it says not to listen to astrology. That's what it says. I know a lot of people probably do and everything, but you're not supposed to, according to the Bible, if you're a Christian. Well, it would be like somebody like me, as a Bible teacher, say, well, I'm lost here. I don't know what's going on. And instead of going to the Bible, I went to psychics.com. What have you? I don't know. And asked for their advice. And God said, don't do that. But he did it anyway. He did some other stuff too. He took upon himself the role of a priest. He took upon himself the role of a king. Only Jesus is king, priest. That's it. There's no other person that's really a king and a priest, okay? And so, but he takes upon himself the role of king and priest. He's not supposed to do that. He does it. And Samuel says, yeah, God is going to replace you as king. Well, he loses his mind. And remember, he didn't even want to be king. But then he does, and he doesn't want to give it up. And so when he starts seeing that this young guy named David, who's already killed Goliath and done all these things, and the people start really liking David, he says, oh, it's David you're going to replace me with. And he tries to kill David. And he goes after him with abandon. Now, it's interesting. We're going to talk about David next. But David doesn't. He has the opportunity to kill Saul a few times, and he doesn't do it. Saul catches his mind again, says, oh, well, you're more righteous than me. I'm sorry for wanting to kill you. Come back in and live in the palace with me. I mean, it wasn't in Jerusalem yet, so it was some sort of a palace, but I don't know how big. And so, but shortly after David comes back again, he actually gives him Michael, his daughter Michael, to marry. And so, kind of joining the families together and all that kind of stuff. But he loses his mind again, tries to kill him, chases him all over the place, and, he's going to kill him. He goes to battle. His last battle is recorded, and he's losing. And when he's losing, his son, Jonathan, who was David's best friend, they were like tight, and they're on the top of a mountain, and they're getting surrounded, and the enemy is mean to each other. Okay, these people were not nice to each other. The Israelis weren't nice to each other. I know that, but the enemy wasn't nice either. They did some horrible things to each other, and he doesn't want that to happen to him as king of Israel. So he asks his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer doesn't kill him. He says, I don't want to. He's scared to do it. And so that's a young boy who carried your stuff. I mean, he's not even at war age to go fight in a war yet. And so he's young and he doesn't want to do it. And Saul says, oh, okay, give me my sword. So he takes his sword and he lands on it. He just jumps on it, kills himself, and then has the armor bearer cut off his head. Okay, I don't understand all that, but he did not want to be disgraced by these people. So anyway, that's the story of the end of a beautiful beginning, but a bad ending. Okay, he lost his mind. He had a lot of problems, and he went away from God. I don't know if that caused the mental problems or not. I don't know, but I really don't get it because everybody's an individual, and only God can judge him. And I'm not judging him. I'm just telling you the story of what happened to him. All right, now David is the one that takes his place. Now, there is a son in between. Okay, Jonathan's now dead. There's another son. He is in between, but that's the one I don't remember how to pronounce his name and don't know anything about him. So we're really not going to talk about him, but we're going to go to the next king, which is David. Now, Saul, he reigned for 42 years is what it said. And so he was there for quite a while. All right. He was an old man by the time he died. I mean, he was old. He was 72. I think he started at 30 and he died after 42 years. So he's 72 years old. He's an old man by the time he dies. Okay. But David is now 30 years old. And even though he's been around since a teenager, because remember, he killed Goliath when he's a teenager. We all know the story of David and Goliath. He's a teenager and his brothers go to war. He's too young to go to war because you got to be 20 to go to war. And in Israel, you can't go to war before you're 20. And he's a teenager, so he doesn't get to go. Then he comes and he sees this giant from the Philistines defying everybody. And he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine mocking God? And he goes out there and he fights him. It's a long story. Saul actually says, okay, well, wear my armor. And he goes, I don't want to wear this armor. It's too big for me. Because remember, Saul's a big guy and David's just a teenager and he's not very big. And so he says, no. And he takes a sling and 5 smooth stones and he goes out there and he faces Goliath. And Goliath says, I'm going to feed your bones to the birds, And but that wasn't what happened. And he threw this sling, which they did use in warfare in those times, and it hit Goliath right between the eyes. And like a bullet, it killed him. He got shot between the eyes. That's exactly what happened. And he fell down and then... Well, whether it killed him or not, knocked him out at least, but I think it killed him. But then David pulled the giant sword out, which must have weighed a lot for David. But he lifts it up and he cuts off Goliath's head and the enemy runs away. And the Israelites win the day. Okay? Well, he's just a teenager. He doesn't be king yet or anything like that, although Samuel was already told that he was going to be the next king. Samuel was already told that. And he did kind of tell David's family, but I'm like all right now, I don't know if everybody believed it. Okay, I don't think they believed it because of the way they treated him when he showed up for the battle. His brothers even mocked him. So I don't think anybody believed that he was going to be the next king, but God always knew it, Well, anyway, he hangs out with the family and does all these things until Saul dies. And he had the opportunity to kill Saul on a couple of occasions and he didn't take it. He said, I will not touch God's anointed. Because remember, Saul was anointed to be king. And David loved God, and he wasn't going to do that. I think it was 2 times ago, 2 episodes back, I brought up a song by a guy that sang about God not liking music, I think is what I said, because it was, he goes, there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do you? It goes like this: the 4th, the 5th, the minor fall, and the major lift. The battled king composes hallelujah. It's a beautiful song. I don't judge it by my voice. I got a terrible singing voice. But anyway, that's the David. He sang to God. And when Saul was having mental problems, he asked for David to play because it calmed him down. Okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, we didn't understand. They knew nothing about psychology back then, but it makes sense. Okay, well now Saul is died not by David's hand, actually by his own hand, but not by David's. And now David is going to become the king. Now, at first, he's just the king of Judah and Benjamin and a couple of little surrounding stuff. And that's when he was 30. By the time he's 37, he's king of everything. All 12 tribes, they all respect him. He is King David. His men take over Jerusalem, and because before that it was not theirs, Jebusites lived there, and they took over Jerusalem, which right now they're having to fight over Jerusalem again. But that it is the capital of the Israeli nation. It was from David's time. They went in there, they captured it, and that's where his palace was built. Which, by the way, they've uncovered at least one wall. It is interesting. Archaeologically, they got at least a wall down there that they believe was David's time. And it looks like he really was a pretty big deal. And when I went to college, they told me that David didn't even exist. He was like an Arthur character. But that wasn't true. Not only have they found out that he existed, and it was only in the 80s when I was going to college, so, that wasn't that long ago, but my college professor told us that David didn't exist. He was just a made-up character like King Arthur to make the people of Israel feel good about themselves, the same thing that the British did about the Anglo-Saxons, actually, to be honest with you, did about King Arthur, because the Brits he fought the Anglo-Saxons when they came in. That's what he did. And so then that was about 400s, if he even existed. But that was the story of the original story of Arthur and the Round Table and all that. Well, whether he did or not live, I don't know. But David did live. I do know that. We've now uncovered through archaeology, there's a stele where this one guy named Ben-Hadad, and he was up Damascus king, and he fights this guy named Omri, who was king of the northern tribes. This is well after David. This is 100 years later. And even though he wasn't biologically related to David, David was still the famous guy of Israel. And so this Ben-Hadad, who defeats Omri, he writes this in what's called a stele, a big old obelisk thing, in the rock. And he writes how he defeated Omri of the house of David. Yeah, because David really lived, okay? And David was a big deal. 100 years after he was gone, he was still a big deal. Like right now, Lincoln's still a big deal, and Washington's a big deal. I don't know how big deal some of the presidents of us are. Chester A. Arthur, Polk, I don't know, Garfield. I don't know if many people know many things about any of those people, but they were presidents of the United States. But we all know Lincoln, we all know Washington. Well, same thing with David. They may not know the kings in between too much, but they definitely knew David, and they said of the house of David, because he was a real guy. And he was very effective at getting Israel to be the biggest it had ever been, and secured his borders against its enemies and did all that stuff. And he wanted to build God a temple. But God said, you can't do it. You're a man of blood. You killed too many people. I don't want you to build my temple. That's what he said. Look, I'm not questioning what God says. I'm just telling you what he said. Well, so David spent the last quite a few years of his life, even though he had a lot of turmoil. One of his oldest sons, Absalom, I think that was his oldest son, he rebelled against him, led an entire rebellion. David could have quelled it and defeated him, and he didn't do it because he didn't want to hurt his son. He actually left Israel, or left Jerusalem. He stayed in Israel, but he left Jerusalem. He took off because he didn't want to have to kill his son. And that son's army kept pursuing his own father for, power. Too bad, but it happened a lot. In ancient times, it happens a lot today. Pursuing even his own father for power, he ends up getting killed by a general of David. And David never forgave that general for killing his own son. Even though that general did that to save David, David really had a hard time with this. So he had a lot of difficulties in his last years of his life. But he wanted to build that temple that God didn't let him. So he got all the building materials together. From Lebanon, he got the beautiful trees, the cedar trees. From another place he got something, from another place he got something, whatever. He gathered it all together and put it all together. And even though he didn't build the temple, he knew that it was ready to go. And that's what he did for his part to build that temple. All right. He loved God. He wrote tons of music. He wrote psalm after psalm. And if you'll read the Psalms, quite a few of them are written by him. They are songs. And they even say, send this one to the chief musician so that he can put this, for the choir to sing or whatever. I don't know how they did music then. None of us do. But it was music. We don't do music like Mozart did much today. And he didn't do it like they did, with the Gregorian chants a few hundred years before that. And by the way, 300 years from now, they won't be doing music like we're doing it, but it'll all be music. All right, all be music. And David knew how to write music, and he wrote these songs, and we have them to this day. And the 23rd Psalm is a famous one, just super famous. The 22nd Psalm is actually a description of the crucifixion 1,000 years before Jesus was born. I don't think David even knew what he was writing about. He wrote all these words that sounded good together, and turns out there was a real big reason for it. All right. So David was an interesting man. He had a lot of good and a lot of bad. He sinned. He sinned terribly in his lifetime. But he repented of that sin when it was pointed out to him. And at the end of his life, he had prepared all this stuff for his son to build the temple. And that son is the next king. When David dies, David lived from about 940 or 1040 BC to 970 BC. So 1,040 years before Christ, that's when he's born. So he's about 30 years younger than King Saul. But then when he dies, he's 70 years old. It says that in the Bible. He's 70 years old. And he had reigned for about 40 years, from 30 to 70. And when he died in Jerusalem. But he had something wrong with him that they didn't understand it, but he was cold. So he had no circulation. And they even tried to keep him warm. It even says all that in the Bible. Just an interesting side note. That's why I love the Bible, because it's got interesting stuff in it. Anyway, so when he dies, he's got quite a few kids. Well, he doesn't leave it to his oldest kids. He leaves it to one of the younger kids. And not the youngest, but one of the younger ones. And that is a guy named Solomon. And he says Solomon's going to be in charge. And then I'll talk about that next week, about Solomon and his struggles at the beginning of his kingship, and the struggles after he leaves, because that will be interesting. Because Solomon's a very fascinating guy. But this week we talked about King Saul and King David. But man, these people, Saul lived from about 1070 BC till just before the turn of that time, probably around 1007, 1003, somewhere in there, years BC before he dies. And then David comes up. He's born about 930 BC, and he reigns really from about 1010 BC till 970 BC. I guess Saul must have died around 1010. He must have died right about that, because he did not become king until Saul already died, and he had a 40-year kingship. So David did, and he ended it in 970. So that puts him back to 1010 BC. Then Solomon takes off. We'll talk about him next week, but his kingship takes off at 970 BC, and he lasts until about 931, we believe, BC. So he also had a 40-year. Actually, you think about it, I never really thought about that till right now. But all of them had, all three first kings of Israel had a 40-year reign. 42 years, 40 years, and maybe 39 years, an average of 40 years apart. That's interesting, because there's 40 days and 40 nights. There's 40 years in the desert. The first three kings of Israel reigned for basically 40 years apiece. That is, I don't know, that all fascinates me. God has reasons for what he does. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And I'm not going to pretend I do, but I certainly can notice it, that there's some sort of consistency here. Well, look, we're about done then now with this episode. I am going to ask if anybody's still listening. I always forget to do this, but could you if you're watching on YouTube, could you hit like and subscribe? And I appreciate if you're just downloading on the podcast. We're on pretty much every podcast that I know of: Audible, Spotify, Apple iTunes. But if you're watching on YouTube, could you hit like and subscribe, please? I appreciate it. And well, now I guess we're just about 10:10 on this episode, and I hope you join us again. Thank you.